Hello, and welcome to the Godot community for High School Visual Art 3D. This is the final installment in our series about mold making and slip casting.
So I have two slip cast tiles that have been able to dry. So these are completely bone dry. And most of you are probably using a stoneware clay in your classes. I know that is what I use. So this is a little bit different. This is a really smooth, low grog slip that we've used. So it sands really, really well. When I clean up the edges of a tile, I usually use one of these green scratch pads. This is best done in a ventilated area, either outside or at least with an exhaust fan. You should be wearing a mask, or the students should be wearing a mask if you're indoors. It does generate quite a bit of dust, but you don't have to do a lot in the way of maintenance for these. So I typically just get rid of any tool marks or marks that were made as I was attempting to remove the mold from, the cast from the mold. You can also see there are some there's a little line there, and that is what I poured the slip out, and then I added more slip. That second line is that addition of extra slip. So I might try to get that sanded down just a bit. But really not a whole lot of maintenance to do, again, because the slip is so fine and smooth. It's going to come out pretty clean. I do have some writing on the edge, so I will take my dry paintbrush and then I will go in. And you might also, if you need to, my corner's kicked out a little bit here, so I might need to go in. And that would be more so if I were trying to butt two tiles up against one another. I would want to make sure that these edges were as straight as possible. But if they're standalones and you're just making multiples, so this is actually a free art piece. If this is a standalone, then cleaning it up is enough. You don't have to overly concern yourself with whether or not it is going to be flush against another tile. Also, and I tell my students this often, we have to remember that what we're doing here is we're making handmade objects. So we're not always going to have perfection. So it might be okay that there's a little irregular gap between your tiles. I think for the most part, they are still going to fit together. So those little irregularities can somewhat be embraced. Students should be aware, and hopefully they know this anyway from working with just their regular clay, that when the clay is bone dry like this and you are going at it with a scratch pad such as this, that it is very fragile and they need to handle it with care. Even in the picking up and setting down, they want to make sure that they're using a pretty soft touch. Another thing that we want to talk about is maintenance of your mold. So some of these molds that I've had for years, and students have used them. And, I want to make sure that I maintain them and that they do degrade a little bit after every use, just like a printmaking block would degrade a little bit after each use. So they get little broken edges or pieces come off or whatever. But my main concern initially is that I am blunting or rounding the edges so that the plaster doesn't chip and mix in with the clay. So if you have something like a Surform tool, works really great. But if you don't have a Surform tool, which my students always refer to as the cheese grater, You can just use a fettling knife or an X-Acto knife, or you can go back to just using your scratch pad. But basically, all you're doing is you're removing this sharp edge and you're rounding it so that when it's picked up and set down on a flat surface, it isn't chipping and breaking apart. So I will do that to all of the sharp edges. And I usually will go back in with the greens. These green scratch pads are just miracles. I will leave this sharp edge because that sort of frames out my tile, but I will round this all the way around, and that will help from getting plaster in my clay. Another thing that you want to be aware of is really the only good way to remove your cast from your mold is to sort of bang it against your hand. And over time, if that's done repeatedly, I've had molds break while I'm doing this, just break in half. And again, these molds are not meant to last forever. So that potentially is something that might happen. But to make sure that it doesn't happen often or, right away, don't bang the mold against a hard surface. So use your hand or use some other padded surface to remove your cast from your mold.
Now that you know the process, how can you apply it to your classes? I've used slip casting and mold making for projects anywhere from just making sprigs and, from ready-mades or from smaller pieces that students have created and using them as surface to having individual or tessellated tile pieces that fit in. Puzzle piece like. For sculpture, I think the process of casting, whether it's slip or plaster or metal or wax, is just a valuable process for the students to understand. For ceramics, it's just another construction technique for them to have in their toolbox. For sculpture students who have less experience with clay, if you're casting a ready-made object, it can be really effective. And there are a lot of artists, so looking at artists who focus on creating multiples, and through this creation of multiples, they reinterpret the meaning of the object in how they are composing the objects, is a really good talking point. For ceramics, again, using cast work as surface decoration or to mass produce functional objects. I think of mold making and slip casting have the potential for a lot of talking points. The idea of mass production and originality as part of an artwork's value. There could be a discussion of how technology plays a role in how artwork is produced, because the idea of mass production is certainly a revolutionary idea that is not too old. And as mentioned previously, there's definitely an art integration component with art and science that could be explored. That there's a lot of chemistry involved in both the making of the mold and then the component or the makeup of the slip, and always the firing process, whether it be the bisque or the glaze fire. So it's really a potential for a lot of conversation. And as always, the students really, in my experience, the students are enamored by the plaster process, the chemical change, and being able to replicate something that they have made or an object that someone else has made, and then thinking about how they can create multiple versions of that and put together as an artwork.